Hello and welcome to The World Today on Channels Television. I'm Cynthia Are. It's a very big day. There's been breaking news all around the globe, and just a couple of minutes ago, we understand that the leader of the Somali Islamist group Al-Shabaab, that's Ahmed Godani, was killed following a U.S. attack earlier this week. The U.S. carried out airstrikes on Monday night targeting a convoy in which he was traveling. It had placed a bounty of $7 million on his head. And the Pentagon press secretary has said the military action on September the 1st had led to his death. The U.S. has supported the African Union force that has driven Al-Shabaab out of the capital Mogadishu and other towns since 2011. The Al-Qaeda-linked fighters want to overthrow the UN-backed Somali government and frequently attack government targets as well as neighboring countries that provide troops to the AU force. Now, also, we're talking about good news now. Today is certainly a good Friday for the likes of Russia and Ukraine in particular. The Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko has announced the successful signing of a preliminary protocol to start a ceasefire between Ukrainian government and pro-Russia rebels meeting in Minsk. President Petro Poroshenko said he would do everything possible to end the bloodshed. The rebels said the truce had not changed their policy of advocating separation from Ukraine, though. Western countries are meanwhile working on further sanctions against Russia. The West accuses Russia of sending arms and troops to back the rebels in eastern Ukraine, but as always, Moscow denies this. The talks in Minsk, capital of Belarus, involve former Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma and Russian ambassador to Ukraine and leaders of the self-proclaimed People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, it's been 2 intense days in Wales where members of the NATO discussed various issues, and top of the agenda were the crisis in Ukraine as well as the Islamic State militants. The meeting has been far from futile as a peace deal has been signed concerning Russia and came into effect exactly 1.5 hours ago. And concerning the Islamic State, David Cameron has referred to all extremists as being one and the same, whether they manifest in the form of Al-Qaeda, IS in Iraq or Syria, or Boko Haram in Nigeria.
It's day 2 of the NATO summit, and NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen and British Prime Minister David Cameron opened the second day of talks, with both leaders calling for greater unity in the face of growing threats from several parts of the world. Addressing the meeting, Rasmussen said all members of the alliance were duty-bound to defend each other.
Our 28 countries are united in a commitment to common values: freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And we are bound by an ironclad commitment to defend one another against attack. All for one, one for all.
This came a day after NATO demanded that Moscow withdraw its troops from Ukraine. The European Union and the United States are preparing a new round of economic sanctions against Russia for its incursion. Addressing the meeting, Britain's David Cameron mirrored Rasmussen's sentiments and said NATO was needed more than ever to face the threats presented by Russia and Islamic State IS.
You've seen real unanimity here that everyone has to play their part. We have to make ourselves safer at home. We have to help those on the ground, like the Kurds. We need a new Iraqi government that can represent all of the people. We need to make sure that players and countries in the region and neighbors help out with this work. And yes, we work with our allies to help those people on the ground and take all the steps necessary to put the squeeze on ISIL. That's what today has been about, but real unanimity and the proposals for important action.
This comes as envoys from Ukraine and Russia are expected to announce a ceasefire as a starting point for a wider peace plan. Ukraine says its forces are trying to repel a big offensive by the rebels to take Mariupol, a port city of around 500,000 people on the Sea of Azov, crucial for its steel export. It stands about halfway between Russia and the Russian-annexed Crimea region. Now that a peace deal has been signed by Russia and Ukraine, all the sanctions imposed on it formally could be lifted altogether once implemented.
If it gets implemented in a sustainable way, that is to say, we start to see Russian troops going back into Russia, the supply of equipment to the separatists ending, the shelling and rocket fire from across the Russian border into Ukraine ending, then of course we can then talk about lifting sanctions off. But I don't think we should be deterred from going down the course that we've set out simply by noises about a possible ceasefire.
The threat of the Islamic State is also being discussed. The United States is forming a core coalition to battle IS militants in Iraq, calling for broad support from allies and partners but ruling out committing ground forces. The U.S. Secretary of State is very optimistic that the allies could develop a comprehensive plan for combating IS in time for this month's annual UN General Assembly session in New York.
We're now being joined live from the Pentagon by the Voice of America's Carla Babb. And now I hope you can hear and see me.
I can
Hello,
hear
Carla.
you just
Thank you so
fine.
much for joining us on The World Today. I'm sure it's been a very busy day in the Pentagon, but, you know, it appears as though NATO has solved one crisis, that's concerning the Ukraine crisis, now that a peace deal has been signed. But what are the options concerning, you know, offensives that might be carried out against the Islamic State militants?
With the Islamic State militants, they have still not said that they're going to have any ground forces in Syria as of yet. In the recent days, about probably over a third of the U.S. troops that they had sent to Iraq have arrived there, of the total of 350 that they announced just a couple of days ago. The U.S. is determined that targeted airstrikes to protect U.S. interests, to protect citizens that are going to prevent a humanitarian crisis, that is their goal.
Well, you've basically answered the second question I was going to ask you concerning if they would resort to having a boots-on-ground situation. But you were talking about airstrikes just now, and just a couple of minutes ago, we understand that the Al-Shabaab leader has been confirmed killed based on airstrikes which were carried out on Monday. Have there been any briefings in the Pentagon concerning that?
They have made that official. Kirby just said that it was a major symbolic and operational loss to Al-Shabaab. They did confirm that it happened during an airstrike on Monday. They had been holding off for several days because they were waiting on intelligence to confirm whether or not he was indeed killed. But they do say Ghadani, the co-founder of Al-Shabaab, was killed in the airstrike.
Finally, I'd like to ask you concerning the issue of ransom payment. We know that NATO does not necessarily give into paying ransom for hostages being held by any form of extremists. But I'd like to ask you, what are the plans concerning hostages that are being held by the Islamic State militants, like the Britain or any other hostages that we might have not necessarily seen? What is the plan? Is there going to be a new rescue operation attempt, or what's the fate of those that are being held right now?
Well, it's just a horrible situation. It's one of those because the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. So if someone is captive, the United States is not going to go in and say, okay, we'll exchange, we'll do this, we'll do that. No, they do not feel that terrorists have that right because they're not using diplomacy, they're not using normal, humane means to get their messages across. There was an attempt to rescue James Foley, who was the American journalist who was killed first. They have not come out and said whether or not there was a rescue attempt the second time to help any of the other Americans that the Islamic State have. But right now, their main focus is the airstrikes. The airstrikes they feel to protect U.S. interests, to protect U.S. allies that are in humanitarian situations.
Carla Babb from the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for speaking with us on The World Today. I've been speaking with the Voice of America's Pentagon correspondent from the United States. Now, in other news, the global nuclear watchdog, IAEA, has confirmed that Iran has missed a deadline to answer questions about its nuclear program. Initially, Iran had agreed to provide information to help allay concerns about a military dimension to its program, but have failed to do so. The US, EU, and other powers suspect Iran is secretly seeking to develop nuclear weapons. Iran has strongly denied the charge, insisting its program is purely for peaceful purposes. Still talking about Iran, the country's supreme leader has approved cooperation with the US as part of the fight against the Islamic State, that's IS, in Iraq. Ayatollah Khamenei has authorized his top commander to coordinate military operations with the United States. Iraqi and Kurdish forces have also confirmed that information in Tehran today. Meanwhile, Iran has traditionally opposed U.S. involvement in Iraq. That's an Iranian ally. However, Shia Iran sees the extremist Sunni IS group, which views Shias as heretics, as a serious threat. In other news, rescuers at a coal mine in Bosnia have freed 29 trapped miners, but 5 others were confirmed dead after a gas plant caused by a small earthquake. The survivors were pulled one by one out of the mine in Zenica after spending the night more than 500 meters below ground. Relief among people waiting outside turned to anguish when it became clear that all the 34 men had survived, and not all of them had survived. 22 other miners escaped before the pit collapsed last night, and the 3.5 magnitude quake had struck northwest in the capital. The explosion which triggered the collapse was the 3rd such incident at the facility this year.